Do you know the difference between a fairy tale and a sea story?
What's that?
The difference between a fairy tale and a sea story?
Yeah.
Fairy tales start out once upon a time and end happily ever after. Sea stories start out by the teller saying, "You aren't going to believe this, but it really happened." And they end either humorously or sometimes tragically. So, having said that, I will tell you some sea stories, all of which I vouch for and are true.
Very cool.
How I joined the Air Force is kind of a story in itself. In 1954, I was growing up on my dad's cattle farm in South Dakota. And let me tell you, winters are there, and drove us out all the way to California in hopes of finding sunshine, I guess, and we did. After I graduated from high school, my brother and I were working for an independent telephone company installing dial system in this rather remote area that we lived in. And when my folks went to California, I went with them, and my brother came along, maybe 6 months later. He finished up his work in Browns Valley, Minnesota, not exactly a metropolis. And so within a week, we went down to the telephone company in California, thinking we might sign on. And when you see my picture at that time, you'll understand why, one, we didn't get the job. Anyway, my brother went in and interviewed, and the result of the interview was that the last line from the interviewer was, "We only hire veterans. Are you veterans?" Well, I looked like I was 15 and couldn't get by because I had a draft card, and so did my brother. So we kind of walked out, and my brother Roger said to me, "Well, Rod, what do you want to be a veteran of?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, I don't want to be a Marine because they're usually the first to go." This was right after the Korean War. And I said, "I had enough sleeping on the ground as a Boy Scout, so why don't we join the Navy like our brothers did?" Sounds like a good deal to me. I've always wanted to go to sea since I've read all the books about going to sea that I could find. And I said, if we get lucky, maybe we'll follow our brothers into our oldest brother, who was in the air wing of the Navy, as well as being a diving officer on a submarine. That was kind of a unique thing. And he said, "Well, can't go to the Navy because can you see me in a sailor?" He was a rather large man. "Can you see me in a sailor suit with 13 buttons on the front when I've been out drinking beer?" And it just doesn't seem feasible to me. And I said, "Well, that leaves the Air Force." So the next day we went down and tried to become veterans of the Air Force. And by gosh, we made it by the initial step. I think everybody probably would have. So we got on the Greyhound bus the next day and was taken to San Francisco for our induction into the Air Force. And I think Roger went out that night to San Francisco and see the town, and with some other guys that were 21. I was 18, couldn't go along. And celebrated their last night of freedom, I guess. And so the next morning, or somewhere the next day, we were loaded on another Greyhound bus and transported to Parks Air Force Base, which has since closed, but it was a big basic military training center for the Air Force on the West Coast. The others were at Sampson Air Force Base and Lackland Air Force Base up in Texas. Sampson was located in New York. So they had the net spread pretty wide to catch as many people as they could, of course. And I've always said joining the Air Force was another one of those remarkable coincidences in a life that's been filled with. Because I owe my time in the Air Force to my subsequent career. At first with the Air Force as a civilian for a year in air traffic control, and then being recruited to join the missile range in when missiles were just starting out.
Mm-hmm.
So after a battery of tests and completing basic training, Roger was sent to Lowry Air Force Base in Denver. And I was sent to Keesler Air Force Base in Mississippi. A real opening of my eyes when I got down south, because I can remember this was during the days of segregation, and it was really segregated. I can remember going to the bus station because there wasn't any air service into Gulfport or where Keesler was located a few miles away from there. And on the way in from the New Orleans airport, I noticed the cab driver kept honking at black people who were driving in his lane and cussing them out for being there. So my next experience was at the Greyhound bus station. To get to Gulfport, I went to the back of the bus. And the driver came back and said, "You can't sit here." And I said, "Why would that be?" He said, "You can't sit here." So the Air Force security police were there, and they came in and explained why I couldn't sit there in rather graphic terms.
Mm-hmm.
So I went forward and I said to them at the time, being a wise young man, I said, "Well, I think the safest place is in the back of the bus." They didn't appreciate that. They just said, "Go up there and sit down." So I did, and ended up at Keesler Air Force Base in what they call a casual squadron. That means you get to draw dirty details every morning until you're assigned to a school. That lasted about a month, and I got myself assigned to the base hospital in what I thought was a pretty cushy job compared to some of them that were around.
Mm-hmm.
All I had to do was mop floors and carry dinner trays to the patients. So that lasted about 30 days when I got myself assigned to the Electronics Fundamental School, which lasted about 36 weeks or longer. And then you would go to what was called SETS school, where you learned one specific radar. So at that time, I met two pretty good guys that were in fundamentals with me. A guy by the name of Dean Seelock, who had been a semi-truck driver in his civilian life, and another one named Larry Houchin, who grew up on a cattle farm just like I did.
Mm-hmm.
So we hung out together quite a bit, and our big motivation was that we had to be just above average, not to flunk out of the school, for if we did, we knew we were going to end up in the security force and or as cooks and bakers. That was a little incentive they gave you. So by gosh, we studied and were average students. Got to keep our pass to town. And so we kind of got through school there and went on to such school. Larry went to airborne and Dean went to long range aircraft control and warning radars along with me. And we studied the radars that we would service during our career in the Air Force. Well, we got through that too. And I was dispatched to Boron Air Force Station to the 750th ACNW Squadron, located at Boron, California, very near Edwards Air Force Base. And my first job was being a casual again, and it was hauling cement to build a tennis court, which I did for a while. My security clearance finally came through. And there's a story there about one of the people I interviewed, but I'll leave that for later. And it was not a radar that I'd been trained on. So started to learn it, and was told that I was being transferred to Las Vegas Air Force Station near Las Vegas, as the name implies. And so we jumped in one of the guys' cars there, who was also being reassigned. I did not have a car when I was in the service, because I noticed that anybody that had a car spent all their time working on it. or paying for it. So anyway, we drove to Las Vegas and stayed the night in Las Vegas in a motel. Next morning, we got up and thought, well, now we better go find the squadron. So we drove to Nellis Air Force Base, which was on the outskirts of Las Vegas, and nobody knew where this place was located. Finally, somebody looked it up and said, well, you go out Highway 90, turn left, and go toward Mount Charleston Lodge, which is marked. And then you go up the side of this mountain, and then you go further up the side of this mountain, which was like 1 lane wide, gravel road. Got up to the top, and there was the radar squadron. Now, they didn't tell us that the radars had to be installed. So we started doing that, learning a lot about installing a radar, and everything from rigging it and putting it in the air pressurized radome to testing it, which was another lucky break because I got to learn a lot. So daily life at Angel's Peak, which this radar was on, consisted of, after we got it installed, consisted of doing 6 shifts in 5 days.
Wow.
Each shift was 8 hours long. You'd do 2 shifts and then do what we called double back in 8 hours and go back on duty for 2 more shifts of some other time period, double back and go on 2 more. We were rewarded by 3 days off in between the rotations. Well, this was a pretty good deal because I really wanted to get ahead, so I would study books and laid hands on somewhere in the library, volume 2 of MIT's radiation lab studies that gave the background and a lot of mathematics that I didn't understand, but I got the gist of it. And we had 3 what were called tech reps, representing Bendix Corporation and Philco Corporation, who had built this monster. And I have pictures of it. So the high points of that tour was, learning the radar, listening to the tech reps who would go out of their way to teach you if you would listen. And I did. Then I'll give you the why we were there. The radar station overlooked 2 things: the atomic test flats and Groom Lake, which is now known as Area 51. Our primary job was to control the U-2 as she entered and took off from Groom Lake during tests. The other one was we supported Operation Plum Bob during the last above-ground nuclear test conducted in the United States. We controlled the sampling aircraft going in and out of the area there, taking samples of the mushroom cloud. I don't know whatever happened to these guys, except one of them. I met one of the pilots when I was with NASA. So from there, I was just to back up, the Air Force has 3 skill levels, 3, 5, and 7. The 3 I got from school, the 5 I studied, took the test of 150 questions, passed it.
Wow.
And then I found an obscure regulation that said I could take it as an airman first class, but I had to make staff sergeant in a year or I'd revert to airman first class and my 5 level. So the 7 level test was, I studied and took it, and it was one of the hardest tests I've ever taken in my life. to be perfectly honest, you could go through an Air Force test and pick off the gimme questions. Usually 7 to 10 questions you knew the answer to. I went through the first 150 questions, got one give me lesson, which was one give me question, which was, I can remember it to this day, and had to do with bifilar windings in a transformer, and I just happened to know the answer.
Yeah.
And I picked that one off, so I put my head down. Now, there were no calculators in those days. If you were lucky, you brought your slide rule with you, or you used the trig tables and the tables they furnished. So I was taking the test with 4 or 5 other guys in there with all trades in the Air Force, from cooks and bakers to security policemen to aircraft mechanics. Pretty crowded room. So I put my head down and started going through the test one at a time. And everybody smoked in those days. So midway through the test, did about 50 questions or 70 questions, somewhere in there. Took a cigarette break, looked around the room, and all the guys I came with are gone. And I said, geez, Rod, you really didn't study enough. These guys have been in here taking the test and have bailed out already. So I went along, and they announced you had a few minutes left to complete the test. And to be perfectly honest, I had about 10 questions to go, so I just guessed at them. It was a multiple guess test anyway. So I knocked those off guessing. Went outside, and all the guys are standing around having a cigarette break. So they said, geez, Rod, did you complete the whole test? And I said, yeah, but the last few questions, I just guessed at them. And they said, wow, we looked at the test and we started out, and we said, this is beyond us. We'll just leave and wait for you. So time goes by, and we return to the squadron, and more time goes by, and finally they posted the results. And of the 150, I believe my score was 137. Not too bad for guessing at some of them. So I got my 7 level as an airman first class, which was kind of unusual. So I became a crew chief. We were always short of people. Sometimes the crew consisted of myself and one other guy. But I came pretty good at troubleshooting this radar with the help of the field engineers that were there representing the factory. And not being the smartest kid on the block, I kind of developed my own system of keeping track of this big monster, and drew a block diagram down to every stage in the radar, along with the wave shapes on it. It used to take me about an hour to complete it.
Yeah.
And that was kind of my my introduction to troubleshooting with just little block diagrams, which I'd find easier when I got into the computer business using their logic diagrams. So as time would have it, I did make staff sergeant. And shortly thereafter, well, not so shortly, I was transferred to West Mesa Air Force Station, just outside of Albuquerque. And, I might say at this time I was retrained on a more advanced radar when I was at Las Vegas. And there's a story there too. So anyway, I was transferred to West Mesa Air Force Station in Albuquerque for my last 3 months. The reason was the 707 was just coming into service, and the Air Force owned all the airspace. When I say owned, the only guys that could get above it, from about 25,000 feet to higher. And now these 707s were operating in that area, and they wanted to track them across the United States. And so I was assigned to Albuquerque, and actually was on duty when the first 707 left Los Angeles and flew to New York. And we tracked it, and for me, this hot radar mechanic, and you were only a mechanic to everybody when you got to be really good at it. Everybody else was a technician. And I was proud to be an air mechanic. That was just the term used amongst all the guys.
Right.
So while I was there, another aside, my roommate and I met a couple of young ladies from Los Alamos. And we would go up there on weekends to see them. And I got a tour of Los Alamos and, or what the part that she had anyway. And she had the photo lab. And there was a guy in there who was getting some photo plates developed. And he looked at him and he was just transported to some level higher. And he was so excited. And I asked him, "Doctor, what do you see there?" And he says, "What I don't see."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, Anyway, after he left, Patsy Williams, my girlfriend, explained to me that he had been working on this for years, and he devolved this system of if he did this series of experiments and didn't get the result, his theory would be correct. And I was there on the day he did that. And I said, "But yes, I could probably use that sometime. If you don't know what it is, what isn't it?" And you could use this during troubleshooting, because it's not this, it's not this, it's not this, must be this. And by gosh, 9 times out of 10 it would be. So anyway, these are sea stories, I guess. I went back to the squadron and was working. I got the pleasure of getting up every time the 707 transited, and that would be about twice a day. So one night I walked in and past the simulator room, and I noticed these 2 airmen were just in there busy as they could be. And I went in, and now the FAA had controllers to control the 707. I went up to his console, and I'm listening to the aircraft and listening to the controller. And the controller's got what we call an intruder on the scope. And he's calling to the 707, "Do you see this guy?" "No, I do not see anything up here. We're clear." And he said, the 707 pilot said, "Look, if you don't, if this guy is really at my altitude in my area, I don't see anything. Have them turn their landing lights on." So the controller just puts out a call to aircraft in such and such an area. Flash your landing lights. 707 comes back. "I don't see a blankety blank thing up here. And if you don't get me out of here, I'm going to have to dump this thing down to low altitude." And that reminded me that there were 2 airmen, 2 operators in the simulator room. So I looked at the display and I said, "Simulated target." Went back and told these guys to shut down in no uncertain terms, because if they haven't seen 2 airplanes collide, I have, when I was in Las Vegas. Not a pleasant experience. I can picture it today, and I'll tell you about that if you want to hear it. So I got those guys straightened out, and I said to my roommate, in charge of the operators, I said, "Red, these 2 guys should meet me at the orderly room because I'm taking them to the wall." He said, "I don't blame you." So I did. And I don't know what happened to those 2 guys. I think they lost a stripe and got 2 weeks in the brig. But back to Las Vegas Air Force Station, I have a write-up on that you might like to see. We were on a 15-minute tune-up and the radar was down. Now, the FAA had nothing to do with controlling civilian aircraft at this time. So I came out of the radar tower after having it back online after doing a routine. And as I came out, I noticed the back door of the operation shelter was open and everybody was running out of it. And they said, "Sergeant Ingerson, we think there's an aircraft down by Las Vegas." Because neither aircraft was under our control, but they collided, and we got to the edge of the mountain there just to watch the wreckage coming down. Of course, everybody was killed. That's why I didn't have a sense of humor about these guys driving this synthetic target around the 707. Also, while I was in Las Vegas, I underwent about 15 or 20 above ground nuclear tests. Made quite an impression on me. I would do some later work as a civilian connected with the tests in the Pacific. Is this boring you?
No, you're fine.
I kind of rattle on here. I do it to my advanced age. So anyway, I completed my tour at the West Mesa station, and let's see. Oh, and they did work me right up to the end, right up to noon on my last day. My brother had gotten out 6 months earlier because he wasn't in quite a demanding skill field as I was, and he started college immediately. He could get out that way. So I said, I don't want to re-enlist in Albuquerque, but I'd probably go home, take a few days, take a month off, and re-enlist on the West Coast, because aircraft control and warning squadrons had all this dandy duty in the Arctic. In those days, they would think that the Russians would come over in long-range bombers over the Arctic. So that would probably be my next tour. And I wasn't lucky enough to get the tour in Japan or Korea. So I wanted to go to the West Coast in hopes that I could do my overseas tour from there at one of the offshore islands where we had radars too. Well, as I said, but I'll go back to Las Vegas and see some of the guys. So I did. And while I was there, the chief engineer for the tech reps came to me and he said, "Why don't you come to work with us?" He said, "Go to headquarters in Palo Alto, and they'll give you a test, which you probably won't have any trouble with. And they'll assign you to a job like I've got." And I said, "Another coincidence. By gosh, I think I'll try it," because these guys were making big money. Well, in the Air Force, I was making about $220 a month. And I started with Focal Corporation. We had the contract to augment the GIs and teach them. At 435, now this sounded like a great deal to me. I doubled my pay. So I was recruited and sent to Philadelphia for about 6 weeks worth of training and instructing. And so when I got there, I looked around and there was Dean Seelock, the guy I'd gone to school with. Another coincidence. So he had a car. I didn't, because I was still saving money for one. And besides, I was going to be transferred from Philadelphia anyway. So we went to school together, and he was assigned to Maine, which is about as close as you could get to the Arctic. And I lucked out and was assigned to the 750th in Southern California, and then subsequently to Las Vegas and in Albuquerque. So I said, well, I'll give it a try, So I did. And I was a Philco tech rep in Houma, Louisiana, at Houma Air Force Station, doing pretty much what I did in the Air Force. And I enjoyed my time there. I finally bought a 1960 Corvair, because it was 1960 by this time. And I had it, and we'd get called out at all hours of the day and night to if the radar were broken, or was broken, I guess. And it was called red time, and you always tried to minimize your red time. So if it was down and the GIs couldn't fix it, we just jumped in a teaching and fix-it situation. And we were kind of unique there because we were the only engineers in town that didn't have to do with the oil industry. And they were developing a new radar there that was supposedly jam-proof. Jamming is a technique that the bad guys would use to take your radar out. And I worked a little bit with them, learning a little more. And but yes, one day I got a call from the boss's boss and said, there's a project in on the West Coast, and it's kind of classified. You have the right clearance. Would you be interested in going? I said, oh boy, a chance to learn something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I transferred to Palo Alto. Well, I get to Palo Alto, and the first thing they tell us is, well, you're got to build the equipment before you're deployed to Alaska. Not exactly dodging the Arctic, am I?
Mm-hmm.
So, and we'll assign you to an assignment here as you build the equipment. So I was assigned to a fabrication lab, and they said, oh, by the way, we're taking your per diem away from you. So I'm at, but we are going to give you a big raise to $456. So I said, okay. And I was assigned to a fabrication lab where they was manned, wasn't manned, it was womaned by every divorcee in Northern California. And their job was to give the kid, who was terribly bashful, a hard time. So I lasted there about 30 days because it's a little expensive in Palo Alto. And we're kind of sharing an apartment with some other guys and doing what would be called hot sacking. In other words, one guy would go to work and the other one would sleep. And I'm getting tired of this. So one day I went across the street to Ricky's Ranchero, where you could get a beer and a sandwich. And I'm sitting there at my table feeling sorry for myself and thinking the situation over. And I said, well, if bad comes to shove, or push comes to shove, I'll go back in the Air Force. I'll get my stripes back because my trade is in demand. But, it's going to be an overseas tour immediately, probably to the Arctic. And I was going to get there anyway because Philco was going to assign me to Kodiak, Alaska. So I'm sitting there feeling sorry for myself, and a guy walks in, well-dressed. And he walked up to me and he said, I know you. You're Rod Ingerson. I said, well, you have the advantage because I haven't a clue as to who you are. And he said, well, in Philco headquarters there in Philadelphia, during a practice lecture, you gave a lecture on moving target indicators that always stuck with me because you were the only guy that was humorous and you simplified it, so I actually understood it. And I said, oh, okay. He said, what are you going to do now? I said, well, I'm going across the street to quit my job. And then I guess I'll re-enlist in the Air Force. He said, oh, you don't want to do that. I said, why? He said, how would you like to join me? I'm no longer with Philco, I'm with Bendix Corporation. And we got a contract in Hawaii. Would you like to go? And I said, sounds warmer than Alaska. And furthermore, I'm going to be out of a job. He said, if you got a place you can hang out for 2 weeks, because I know how you guys were trained and we want you on the project. I said, okay. So I went up to Sacramento, saw my parents for 2 weeks, and I got a call and an airline ticket. And I told this guy I'd try it in Hawaii for a year. So got on the airplane, all dressed up, because back in those days you dressed to fly. Landed in Honolulu. And Honolulu at that time was a rather small town. I think the tallest building was about 7 or 8 stories high. and was met at the airport, which was all open, and it was the old airport, very rustic. And on the way in from the airplane, I looked around and saw all the natives dressed in natives, all the people that lived in Hawaii dressed in aloha shirts and rather casual. So I took off my tie and threw it in the garbage can on the way in. Thought it might be the last one I'd ever wear.
Yeah.
And I reported to the Bendix headquarters building, which was in Kaneohe, Hawaii, just across from Honolulu. There was no tunnels through the mountains in those days. You had to jump the Pali, it was called. You drove over the mountain into Kaneohe. And there they told me I'd be assigned to Christmas Island, about 1,236 miles south of Honolulu. And at that time, the RAF in the English had the island. They had a small contingent of people there that were left over from their Operation Grapple, which was testing nuclear weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And so they said, now go down and get your passport and report to the English embassy because you have to have a visa to go to Christmas Island. So a couple of guys I met with Telemetry Team 1, as we were called, we went down to get our passports, and the passport guy said, oh, we were told to wait for them by the field supervisor. So we go down about lunchtime, put our paperwork in, and the guy that gets the passport said, and we said we were supposed to wait for the passport to be issued. He said, ho, 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 nobody gets a passport in less than 3 days. Been here 20 days, or 20 years, nobody ever got a passport in less than 3 days. On the phone to the field supervisor, Pete, they say we have to wait 3 days to get the passport. He said, not likely, the airplane leaves tomorrow morning. So he said, let me make a couple of phone calls. You guys go eat lunch and have a beer while you're here. So we did. We go back and our passports are waiting for us. And the guy said, I don't know who you guys are, but I don't want to know who you are. Here's your passports. So we went over to the English embassy, got them stamped. And the next morning we reported to Hickam Air Force Base to fly to Christmas Island on this rather ancient RAF aircraft, which I have a picture of that too. And we went to Christmas Island, and my time there was very interesting because this was shortly after the Second War, and I met a guys that had actually flown in the Battle of Britain that were in the RAF. And they didn't talk too much about it, but I talked to several of them and heard a few things of what it was like. I asked one of them, how old were you when you were doing this? He said, I was 19, kind of young to be flying a Spitfire. So I enjoyed my time there because we'd rotate in and out. And furthermore, well, I got my 25% overseas bonus in Honolulu anyway, but we were guaranteed 7-day work week of 9 hours a day. And we filled that pretty much. So by the time we got, we did our 40 hours and we're on
Did you get,
time and a half and double time on Saturday and Sunday.
Yeah. When
the guy who is saving money was pretty good. Yes.
Yeah. Question for you. When you were over there, did you get to spend much time learning about Pearl Harbor or any of that?
Oh, yeah.
Research.
Sure.
Tell me about that.
Well, I was stationed at Pearl later on, and I'll tell you all about that too, if you don't warn you.
Yeah.
Now, the prime duty, this was with the Discoverer program.
Ah.
And the Discoverer was, you can look this up. When Francis Powers went down with the U-2 in Russia, which kind of surprised us. We figured they would just fly high and gather information about the radars in Russia when I was in. Anyway, they replaced it with a system where they would orbit satellites using the same cameras that the U-2 had on it, but somewhat better and improved, take pictures of the Soviet Union, and from all strange things, Cody, Alaska command station would command this satellite down, and it would land near Honolulu, or so we thought. It might overshoot, and it did, or land short. So they had 2 recovery ships. Well, I went from Christmas Island, as this thing got better and that station was no longer needed, to Telemetry Team 2 to French Frigate Shoals Turn Island. Spent about half my time there, and there we worked more than 8-9 hour days, 7 days a week, because part of what we did was support the Discoverer program and track the Russian ICBMs and orbitals as they were in the area. And from there, I finally landed a good job on one of the recovery ships. And this was the ship I wasn't aboard at the time, captured the first man-made object to return from space. And this is an interesting thing, and you want to make a note of it, because we would snag these things in midair, and if it didn't go in midair, if they didn't catch it in midair, it would go into the water, and we carried 2 helicopters that would pick it up. And we did occasionally, as the Air Force got better at snagging these things. And you can see this process of catching it in midair on YouTube under Catch a Falling Star Part 1 and 2. Now, there was a song called Catch a Falling Star, but you probably or may be aware of that, but you want to see Part 1 and 2 because it details how the Air Force would catch this thing. And the reason it was called Falling Star was that's the way they look when they re-enter. It's very bright. And about 30,000 feet, the parachute would deploy, and it would start to float down, and these guys could actually engage this with C-119 flying boxcar at that time. Old aircraft didn't really do the job, and they were replaced by brand new C-130s, which did the job a lot better because they could get up there.
Right.
So I supported that for quite some time. And this was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, I had myself, not being too dumb, classified as excess to mobilization requirements. Ho, ho, ho. Not exactly true. Got a letter that went back to the ship after eating lunch, and John Kennedy had just announced that the Cuban Missile Crisis was kind of heating up, and went back to the ship, and the supervisor there told me there's a registered letter waiting for you in the purser's office. That letter said, well, when you get the next letter or teletype Western Union thing, you'll report to Hickam Air Force Base for immediate transfer to Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, Air Defense Headquarters. And I thought, so much for hiding out and being excess. I was the only guy on the ship that got one. And so I'm kind of down on this because I was due to be married. So I went back and told my fiance, God, I don't know what to do. The Cuban Missile Crisis is heating up, and I've not been recalled, but I've been told I was probably going to be. Well, as luck would have it, they cooled down the crisis, and I didn't have to go. So I did get married and settled into stay in Hawaii when I said, I'm never going to get ahead unless I get some college, because I didn't have any at the time. A lot of tech school, a lot of hours in tech school. So I decided to return to the mainland and go to school for a while. I'd tested for 2-year GED while I was in the Air Force and managed to squeak by that test too. So I thought it might be good for something when I went back to school. So this is dragging out a long time. I'm afraid I'm boring you.
Yeah,
So
go ahead. You try to summarize if you can, so we can get on to some questions.
Yeah, so
You gotta go get
anyway, I
information.
came back, went to school for a year, and returned to Hawaii. Got a job on the ship again for a while. Then I was transferred to impact location, which was scoring the how accurate the targeting was. And I was assigned to Eniwetok for a year. We used a variety of methods to detect this, and I can determine that, or I can talk about that for a while. Anyway, I did my year at Eniwetok because that's what I had to grade to as my ride back to Hawaii. So I did my year there scoring these things and recovering them, and developed a system for scoring them at night and during bad weather because it was done optically before. And the Air Force wanted to test these things at night, primarily because they had developed a system of decoys to fake out any defense that the Soviets had. So we recovered about 60 of them out there, and then I returned to Hawaii. And during that time, we had some funny incidents that I can tell you about later. Returned to Hawaii, and by now I'd studied enough on my own to be the downrange chief engineer. Because of my background, I had radar telemetry, impact location, some sonar, and we'd sailed out of Pearl. I forgot to mention that. So yeah, we used to tie up right across from the Pearl Harbor Memorial. And if anybody goes to Hawaii, they should see the memorial to the submariners.
Yeah.
And the people that I still get emotional about.
Yeah.
That the names are inscribed on the memorial.
Right.
It's quite an experience.
Yeah.
So anyway, I was stationed at Pearl with the ships and did the engineering or the support for the, most people don't know this, there were ships that supported the Apollo program. And we supported those. I have pictures of them. They're a rather elaborate ship with all kinds of dish antennas on them. And we supported those logistically, and occasionally my guys would go out and help them with some of the technical problems on the ships. They didn't last long because the ground stations became so effective at supporting the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program.
Yeah.
So we did that. And then the Discoverer program was just phasing down. The satellites got to be so good that the resolution was, we couldn't read the license plate on a car, but we could tell you what model it was then when it was parked in the parking lot in some Air Force base in Russia. Pretty good system. And that was phasing down because now they had downlinks that would transmit all the data. No need to recover the capsule. So for fill out, I was assigned to Kaina Point to the tracking station there, installing at that time the most accurate tracking radar in, as far as we knew, the world. And I did that for a while when got that in. And I was transferred back to Vandenberg Air Force Base, the headquarters for the Pacific Missile Range. Nobody knows about the Pacific Missile Range because all the manned launches were out of Canaveral. And so I was working at Vandenberg when my wife whispered in my ear that she was tired of not knowing what I did for a living and that I'd go to work, and she didn't know if I was ever coming back.
Right.
And she said, well, and then she spent 6 months proving to me that she didn't want to be married. She said, told me if I was married, I would be married to you, but I've been married all my life. So we parted ways, and now my brother just happened to be at Vandenberg at that time. And I'd gone to, we'd just gotten a contract, Federal Electric Corporation, just gotten a contract at Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena, Deep Space Flight Center. And I had just completed computer school because I wanted to know what went on with computers. That was a cram course at Northrop in Los Angeles. We did in 9 months, we did what was normally taught in 2 years. Another one, don't drop your pencil or you'll miss something. So I returned to Vandenberg, and they sent me, I said to my boss, I don't want to be in Santa Maria, California with an ex-wife. Mm-hmm. And he said, okay, we have a contract with Jet Propulsion Lab. Go down there, I'll arrange for you to have an interview. Strangest interview I ever had. Walked in and met my mentor, who later became my mentor, actually. Project manager named Chester Prickett. Never forget the guy. He said, here's how you get to the lab. Go out and look it over and tell me what you think about it. I said, no. He said, I already read your resume. I know you can do the job. I thought that was kind of strange. Went out to the lab, and it was not as well organized as I would like to see. Came back and told him, you're kind of got a problem out there. I went into the maintenance room, and there's every broken line printer in the world in there. Furthermore, while I've studied the line of computers they've got there, I haven't studied those specific ones. And he said, oh, don't worry about it. How long will it take you to straighten the place out? I said, oh, about a year, probably. Ho, ho, ho. 15 years later, I was still working on it. But anyway, I went back and talked to my brother, and I said, God, I thought I'd get a job as a technician at JPL. And now they want me to be the manager of what was called logistics, which involved the maintenance of all the computers. And I said, I don't really know if I can do it. He said, oh, it's sometimes easier to run the whole damn place as it is to be a technician. And I know what you've done before, and you can do this job. So I went to Jet Propulsion Lab and lasted until I was 60 years old, and then retired early because it's a young man's game. While I was there, I met my second wife, and she had an interesting job. She was a lecturer for the, better word, publicity department. She would travel the United States with a slideshow of the inner and outer planets. And she had this unique ability to translate science into everyday terms. And I think one of the neatest things that ever happened to her was she got to deliver this lecture at the high school she had attended, which I thought was pretty nifty. So anyway, that's the story of my civilian career. I've got a lot of stories about that. And I had a very quiet Air Force career is the way I look at it, except for the nuclear tests and for the collision. I remember that. And I remember just working my bottom off because after we got the new radar, they actually built me a room in the radar tower so I could sleep up there in case this damn thing broke down.
Oh, wow.
And I did. I worked a good many hours every week in the Air Force, but I attribute that to my going to the missile range, doing all I did after that, going to JPL after I'd gone to more tech schools, and just having that. These were jobs that I would have paid to have. I think I said to the project manager, how much do I have to pay you guys to work here at the lab?
Yeah. What year, Rod, did you enlist into the Air Force?
1955, June 16th, 1955.
Okay. And you
got out June 15th, 1959.
Yeah. Well, how do you feel that the military prepared you for those other jobs?
Oh, gosh, the tech school was great. And it revealed to me what I wanted to do for a living.
Right.
Uh, it under what I considered pretty nice circumstances, because after tech school, and I can show you a picture of where we were quartered, they were World War II barracks,
Yeah.
cold in the wintertime. Uh, I really got into my own when I got assigned to Las Vegas, because technicians were short and
Mhm.
we had to do it. And the only way to do it was study and work with the field engineers that were assigned there.
Yeah.
And I did, because I was really enthused about what I was doing. And I probably would have stayed in the Air Force had it not been for those coincidences.
Hmm.
Um, so I considered and I was in demand as a 7 level. I was in demand. That's how I knew I could get back in if I had to.
Yeah.
While I was in Las Vegas, I met interesting people, and one was the manager of the Silver Slipper Club there. He offered me a job after my time in the Air Force too. But I said I'd already looked into staying with my trade. I said, "What would I do with you?" He said, "I'll teach you everything you need to know." I'd met him by a coincidence when I was in the Air Force, and would go to his house occasionally for dinner when they felt sorry for us. But that was the good thing about the radar stations. They fed us really well. I mean, that was one good thing. And
Yeah.
it was interesting work.
Right.
And I
Right.
learned just a whole lot.
Yeah. That's great. As a civilian and someone who is not in the military, how can we best support our veterans?
Well, I've never had any problem with being supported as a veteran. Around here, there's a high degree of awareness about veterans. Um, I moved here from Fayetteville, um, and there's a big hospital there that I used to use. And that's an excellent facility. It was one of the best in the United States. Now, I've been places where you said you were a veteran, and it kind of, oh, you too. Huh? We got a lot of those guys. But I proudly, veterans are allowed to salute during the national anthem. I do. So I'm proud of my service.
Absolutely.
Uh,
Absolutely.
there were a lot of guys when I were just in there to do their time and get out.
Right.
But I recognized it as a time that I could study, learn, and by gosh, maybe I could do something with it when I did get out, if I got out.
Right.
I was perfectly happy in the Air Force, and it hadn't been those coincidences that I got out.
Yeah. What kind of things are you enjoying now in your retirement? What do you like to do?
Well, when I first retired, I worked at a boatyard. I had a boat when I lived in California. I had a 32-foot express cruiser that I kept in San Diego. And after I got things online, I used to go there every week. So I brought it back here, but and worked on it in a boatyard. And I worked in that boatyard for the guys that owned it, and took a test, became a marine surveyor, one of two in Arkansas, I guess, and did that for a while. Really enjoyed it because I love the water. I love boats. I love the sea.
Oh yeah.
And how did I end up in Springfield, Missouri? Well, Carolyn, my second wife, contracted cancer and died. And I was kind of shattered by all this, of course. It's after 33 years. And so I had one of my kids move in with me, but that didn't work out too well. And I was sitting around one night and I said, I think I'll explore these online, for lack of a better word, dating services. So I met Angie online. And that's how I ended up here. And it was kind of funny because guys that are worked on the range, we type in, and that's what we were doing, communicating on the computers. We type in a shorthand. It's phonetic. Like CUL, see you later.
Yeah.
Burn, like BRN, burn. Everything's like bright, BRT. And she thought I couldn't spell, which I can't to this day. So I said, well, enough of this. Why don't we just talk on the telephone? So we did. And she found out that it was, and I think she actually may have been able to read my misspelled words as well as the shorthand, but she came down to see me and we just hit it off. And finally, I sold my house there and moved up here and been very happy ever since. The only thing I have here is, and I hope she doesn't hear this, is Angie's a retired school teacher. She used to teach special needs kids. And I'm getting a little tired of being in the 5th grade because if I go someplace, it's, do you have your jacket? Yes, Angie. These are kind of jokes that we have.
Like
so anyway, that's my biggest, if that's my biggest complaint.
Yeah.
I guess that's pretty good. Now, how did I get to Unity? You may be interested. Someplace along the line, I became convinced, as we call it, and I'm a Quaker, dedicated to those principles. And the reason I go to Unity is there's a meditation group that meets on Sunday evenings, or there used to be. And I attended that because it's, I'm a non-programmed Quaker. We just assemble, and it's a silent service. And if someone speaks, we feel that comes from their heart, and possibly by that mechanism straight from the universe and whoever runs that. So that's how I ended up at Unity, and Angie attends Unity, but we haven't been able to go lately because of this current pandemic.
Yeah, that's all right. That's why there's live streaming. So,
and I've been working on memoirs because I got a million of these sea stories, all of which I told you were true.
Yeah, yeah.
And sometime I'll bore you with some of those.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time, Rod, to tell me these things, and we appreciate your service. So thank you so much.
I've started my memoirs. Take a little time on that. I've got a whole book full of these things. Every squadron I served with is written up now in Wikipedia and things, and I've collected all of them. And here's the little ditty that I attempted to write to head into them. You may be, I'll bore you with that. Friends chide me, saying tales, my oft-repeated tales have gone tiring and old. To me, these memories have not died, nor have they just gone cold. So they burn bright and clear in my memory, hiding there by day, only to come awake by haunting me each long and lonely night. I suffer from insomnia. I only do about 4 to 5 hours at night of sleeping. So gives me plenty of time to think about my past. Yeah. All of which I'm not terribly proud of, but some of it is. I accomplished these things just by tech schools. I have 1 year college.
Yeah, well, that's something to be proud of for sure. Sure.
Yeah, some people at the lab, somebody asked me how because it's Dr. So-and-so and Dr. So-and-so at the lab. And somebody once called me Dr. Ingerson. I said, no, not me. I'm a trade school mechanic and damn proud of it.